It begins not with a scream, but with silence. A royal bedchamber soaked in candlelight, yet reeking of rot. The crown lies untouched on a velvet pillow, not from reverence, but because no one dares move it. A surgeon whispers to a priest. The priest looks away. In the corner of the room, a young queen sobs into her sleeves. Her wedding night turned into a silent autopsy. They called him the King of Spain. They said he would restore glory to the Bourbon name. But history remembers him for something far more grotesque, not the wars he lost, nor the people he betrayed, but a secret so humiliating it rotted his legacy from the inside out. It's one that could not be buried under medals or prayers. One that began not in the battlefield, but in the bedroom, in the heart of Europe, where crowns were heavier than sins. Ferdinand's body became the subject of whispered jokes in foreign courts. They called him El Rey Impotent, the impotent king, the ruler whose loins could not produce an heir, whose marriages dissolved into ghost stories, whose doctors resorted to medieval tortures in the name of royal virility. What kind of nation places its future in the hands of a man broken before he begins? What kind of monarchy demands a miracle from a cursed body? His secret was anatomical, a malformed organ hidden beneath layers of satin and shame. But the horror was not in his body, okay? It was in what his court did to cover it up, in the physicians who sliced him open, okay? In the false brides paraded like offerings, okay? In the blood-streaked sheets that were shown to ambassadors as proof of lies, in the punishments handed down to any who dared speak the truth. And yet, it was not just his shame, it became Spain's, a kingdom that staked its survival on one man's ability to perform a task he could not, a dynasty that fed on denial, a Catholic empire that turned sexual failure into state crisis. And still, he ruled. Still, he punished. Still, he watched as revolutions bloomed and freedom was crushed, all while the most humiliating truth in Europe lay beneath his robes like a festering wound. This is not just the story of a broken king. It is the story of how a secret, whispered in sheets and shouted in foreign salons, can bring a crown to its knees. But before the humiliation, there was power. Before the scandal, before the impotence, before Spain became a whispering continent of mockery and disgust, he was just a boy in velvet, pale, wide-eyed, half saint, half specter, born into the Bourbon line as if fate had chosen a sickly thread to stitch a kingdom back together. The court called him the Desired One, not because they loved him, but because they needed him. Spain was bleeding, and this child was to be the bandage. He grew up among gold-framed mirrors and corridors, echoing with footsteps of fear. His father, Charles IV, ruled in name, but it was Manuel Godoy, the queen's favorite, her suspected lover, who controlled the throne. Cana watched, quiet, bitter, and boiling, as power slipped through his fingers before he even had the chance to grip it. Every lesson in statecraft came stained with betrayal. Every prayer in the chapel was a silent cry for revenge. He learned early that to be royal was to wear a mask. It's one of duty, of piety, of obedience, even as the soul behind it festered. In portraits, he stood noble and stiff, a Bourbon jaw forged from generations of intermarried pride. But behind closed doors, he was already unraveling, paranoid, silent, fragile. He kept to himself, collecting slights like coins, okay, polishing each one for the day he'd repay them all. Then came Napoleon. The French emperor invaded under the guise of alliance. Spain crumbled. Ferdinand seized the chaos, declaring himself king while his father still breathed. The people cheered him, not for his strength, but for the promise he represented. A break from the old shame, a new dawn. But dawn never came. Instead, he was captured by Napoleon and taken to France. And in that gilded prison, he did not grow into a man. He withered into something else. a vessel for humiliation, a king without a kingdom, a son without a father, future poisoned by impotence no one yet dared name. When he finally returned to Madrid, he was hailed again as savior. El Decido, they cried. The desired one returned. But what is a man desired for? If not his ability to produce heirs. Already, whispers rustled through the royal corridors. His first marriage too. Maria Antonia of Naples had ended in silence. No children. Comfort. No evidence that the union had even been consummated. Physicians blamed stress. Priests blamed Satan. Courtiers said nothing, but they looked, and he looked back with fury, because Ferdinand VII had learned the one rule no monarch survives: breaking. Never let them smell your weakness. So he began to drown Spain in rituals, repression, and rage. If he could not prove himself as a man in the bedchamber, he would do it in blood. But the kingdom had tasted the idea of freedom while he was gone. The world had changed. Only Ferdinand remained. The same, a king forged from shadows, shame, and silence. The desired one. A coup would become the most pitied. It was not war that undid Ferdinand VII, nor revolution, nor even the crushing weight of Napoleon's betrayal. It was a bedroom, silent, cold, reeking not of incense or sin, but failure. The turning point came not with a scream, but with a cut. Sigh, his third wife, lay still beneath the canopy of royal silk. Months had passed, years even. No child, no swell of belly, no midwife summoned in the middle of the night. No cries echoing down marble halls, and still he kept marrying. Maria Isabel, Maria Josepha, Maria Christina, queens, all of them, kings wrapped in lace, paraded before a kingdom that watched with mounting impatience. Each ceremony was a royal performance, choreographed to distract from the question Spain dared not ask aloud. Could the king even perform the one act that mattered? Behind doors gilded in shame, physicians murmured diagnoses they dared not write. Some said syphilis, others whispered of childhood illness or malformed anatomy. But the truth was far worse than a name. He was not simply sterile. Height. His body was weak, his bloodline weaker. And in a monarchy where lineage was law, Tan's impotence was not just personal. It was political treason wrapped in flesh. So he turned away from affection and into authority, where he could not create life. He commanded death. Dissenters vanished. Liberals hung from nooses, dressed in dawn. Newspapers were burned. Torture chambers reopened beneath cathedrals. He rebuilt the Inquisition, not out of faith, but fury, punishing the world for the sins of his own body. His court grew, thick with spies and whispers. Even his own family feared him. They tiptoed around his moods, avoided his gaze, staged palace coups, not for power, but for distance. His own brother, Don Carlos, began to stir beneath the silence, waiting, watching. For in the kingdom without an heir, every relative becomes a rival. And then, in a final act of desperation, Ferdinand made a decree that shattered Spain's bones. He would name his unborn child the heir. It was a girl. It was a crime against centuries of tradition, a spit in the face of masculine power. But Ferdinand no longer cared. He was no longer playing politics. He was fighting time, fighting nature, fighting the whispers that wrapped around his legacy like a noose. Let the girl rule, he snarled. Let her wear the crown, they said. I couldn't pass on. And so, with one decree, he split the kingdom. Don Carlos vowed rebellion. The Carlist Wars would bleed Spain for decades, but all of it, the war, the blood, the fire, began not with ideology. It began with a man sitting alone in his palace, staring at a marriage bed that had never borne fruit. A king at war with his own reflection. A crown chasing a child that would never come. The palace grew quieter as his rage grew louder. Not in volume, but in consequence. The bells of joy no longer rang from the towers, and the laughter of heirs-to-be was replaced with the scraping sound of a scribe rewriting laws meant to preserve a dynasty already rotting from within. Ferdinand's body had failed him, so he clung to control like a drowning man grips the last air in his lungs. The court became a graveyard of former allies, exiled ministers, and terrified servants who dared not meet his eyes. He issued orders no one questioned, not because they agreed, but because they feared the scaffold. The walls of Madrid whispered prayers that were not for God's favor, but for the king's death. He no longer dined with guests. He no longer rode through the streets. He no longer smiled, except at executions. Spain watched as its king transformed from monarch to phantom, pale, heavy, swollen from sickness and gluttony. He dragged his useless limbs through the palace like a ghost haunting its own unfinished reign. The portraits of past kings stared down from the velvet halls with pity, not pride. It was not madness. In the traditional sense, it was something colder, more calculated. He still signed papers, still made alliances, still passed decrees, but each one bore the fingerprints of rot. The war against the liberals was no longer political. It was personal. He hunted men who spoke of change, not because they threatened the crown, but because they reminded him of what he could never be: strong, bold, immortal, and beneath it all, a storm brewed. Don Carlos waited like a shadow cast before the flame. Qui whispered to nobles, bribed bishops, and offered a version of Spain still dressed in patriarchal robes. Ferdinand is weak, he said. Let a real man wear the crown. Ferdinand responded not with diplomacy, but with purges. He crushed dissent with boots and blades, as if silencing voices would repair his name. He doubled down on censorship, revived ancient inquisitions, and ordered mass arrests. Prisons overflowed. Streets ran red. The people no longer feared chaos. They began to welcome it, because in Ferdinand's Spain, silence had become its own kind of scream. The descent was not a single fall, but 1,000 small collapses of trust, of dignity, of legacy, and in every mirror he passed, Ferdinand saw not a king, but a man being forgotten while still alive. The man who once paraded through Madrid in embroidered regalia now struggled to rise from bed without assistance. His legs, swollen with gout, throbbed with each breath. His face sagged under the weight of disease and denial. His nights were haunted by fevers, his days wrapped in silence, broken only by the groans that slipped past clenched teeth. The king was dying, but inch by inch, like a punishment stretched across time. They said his skin turned gray, like ash from a fire long extinguished. The palace stank of sour sweat and the decay of unwashed wounds. Servants whispered of ulcers that refused to close, of bloodied linens changed thrice daily, of the king's rage when anyone looked too long at his twisted feet. Gangrene crept up his toes like a black crown, claiming its own dominion. Physicians came and went, offering leeches, poultices, mercury, none of which slowed the descent. His groin, once the kingdom's secret shame, was now the site of oozing infection. Rumors swirled that his attempts to reverse the humiliating condition only worsened it, that desperate treatments had burned him from the inside, that a king with no heir was being devoured by the very seat of legacy. His manhoods, so guarded, and youth, so feared in rumor, had become the theater of his agony in his final years. Ferdinand was more flesh than sovereign. They moved him in silence, like relics moved through a cathedral. Every step was orchestrated, not to preserve dignity, but to conceal its utter absence. His breath came in wet rattles. His mouth soured with ulcers. He drank only wine, heavy, bitter, numbing. His limbs stiffened, his hands shook. His voice, once booming with royal decree, cracked like a broken bell. But even then, he clung to control. He signed decrees with trembling fingers. He plotted against ghosts, forbade mention of Carlos in his presence. He rewrote succession laws with dying breaths, determined that his second wife, so much younger, so manipulated, might bear a child and save his name from vanishing. But the body had made its decision, and God, it seemed, had stopped listening. In the end, Ferdinand VII did not perish in a blaze of glory or martyrdom. He rotted, slowly, publicly, as if Spain itself had to watch every inch of corruption unravel before believing it. There were no grand final words, no poetic ending, just the creak of bones, the gasp of lungs, and the stench of royal decay wafting through the palace halls. And perhaps that was the final irony. A king who had once feared impotence more than death, now left with only death and nothing else. It came not like a storm, but like mold, quiet, creeping, irreversible. Ferdinand VII died on September 29, 1833. No sword touched his chest, no enemy raised arms. He simply ceased. His breath, already thin, broke mid-exhale. His eyes stared upward, unblinking, like a man waiting for salvation that never came. They said his face was bloated, that his lips had gone blue, that his final breath rattled like coins in a tin cup, empty, cold, and metallic. Servants stood in silence, some with hands clasped, others clutching kerchiefs to their noses. The stench had grown unbearable. Death was not a surprise, it was a relief. But what followed was not peace. It was chaos with silk gloves. The room was emptied in minutes. The widow was ushered in with dry eyes and a prepared statement. The documents were retrieved. The line of succession, twisted by Ferdinand's final obsessions, was now law. His daughter, Isabella, just 3 years old, was named queen. A child thrust into the shadow of a man whose shadow had crushed entire generations. No one cried in public. The nobles bowed. The priests, blessed, but Spain, broken and bleeding, turned its face away. In taverns, in alleyways, they whispered about the king's secret, about the body never shown, about the doctors who vanished from court before sunrise. Some claimed his organs had liquefied. Others swore the body was buried in haste to avoid public display. A single dog was seen wandering the palace halls. Night he died. No one knew where it came from, but it lingered outside his chamber door, silent, unmoving, as if waiting to escort something unseen. No royal procession shook the streets. No bells rang long enough to drown the silence. Instead, Spain held its breath, not out of mourning, but out of fear. For Ferdinand's death did not end his reign. It extended it, in paranoia, in dispute, in civil war that erupted like a scream, trapped for too long, and as his coffin was lowered into the crypt of El Escorial, Spain's royal necropolis, the question remained: had the monster died, or had he simply changed shape? In life, he ruled with flesh and ink. In death, he ruled through ghosts. And Spain, once his possession, would now be his battlefield. The king was gone, but his sickness had only just begun. He left behind no peace only, a throne cracked by contradiction, and a crown too heavy for the child meant to wear it. Isabella II was not yet 4 years old when they declared her queen. Her tiny hands could not hold a scepter. Her voice could barely pronounce sovereign. But power does not wait for readiness. Cid devours weakness. And in that weakness, Spain descended into fire. The First Carlist War ignited almost before Ferdinand's corpse turned cold. His brother, Don Carlos, rose with steel in his mouth and divine right in his blood, declaring Isabella's reign a heresy against God. It was not a war for territory, it was a war for legitimacy, for the right to define what Spain was and who it belonged to, and as bodies fell in the name of birthright, the stench of Ferdinand's reign clung to every musket, every bayonet, every banner torn by wind and blood. The streets whispered his name, not with reverence, but with rot. In his absence, poets cursed him, mothers cursed him, even generals cursed him. But none could deny the shape of the wounds they were carved in his image. He had hollowed Spain to feed his whims. Now, those hollow spaces echoed with the screams of civil war. Monuments erected in his name became targets of mockery. Coins bearing his face were spat upon, and yet none of it undid the damage. Spain had not merely lost a king. It had inherited his disease, a disease of mistrust, of secret treaties and public betrayals, of children crowned before they could walk, of queens made to rule over men who sharpened knives behind closed doors. And what of the people, quietly there? Villages burned between shifting front lines. Their sons disappeared into armies led by men who still toasted Ferdinand in private, even as they damned him in public, 'cause his ghost had become useful, a mask, a justification, an enemy to blame. Even as his methods were repeated, the court shifted, the ministers changed, but nothing truly ended. Not the fear, not the silence, not the spectacle of watching a nation eat its future to digest its past. And so, the aftermath was not a new chapter. It was a continuation of cruelty, signed not with ink, but with ash. Ferdinand VII had died, but his legacy lived in mutilation and division, in the endless screaming of a country trying to claw its way out of a coffin he had built around its soul. They do not build statues for humiliation. They bury it in archives, in soft phrases, in sanitized textbooks that say he restored order, as if terror was structure and cowardice was peace. But Ferdinand VII's true legacy could never be carved in marble. It was carved into the minds of those who lived under him, and into the silence of those too ashamed to speak of what they saw. He ruled not with vision, but with vengeance. Every decision was driven by fear of liberals, of women, of freedom, of shadows cast by better men. He spent his life tearing down the future to preserve his comfort. And when that comfort rotted, he demanded that Spain rot with him. His name became a code for failure among the nobility, a cautionary tale among scholars, and a curse among the poor. But the most haunting part was what he left behind. A nation so confused by trauma, it could no longer recognize truth. Under Ferdinand, loyalty was rewarded with nothing. Dissent was crushed with everything. Ideals were poisoned. Words lost meaning. Patriotism became a theater, justice a joke, and monarchy a mask for cowardice. The damage was not just institutional, it was psychological. And in that twisted legacy, something even darker took root precedent. Ferdinand taught the powerful that cruelty could be codified, that weakness could be disguised as righteousness, that a king did not need to be loved, only feared, and feared in the most humiliating way possible. The legacy was not his alone. It was inherited by generals, clerics, and future kings who studied his script like gospel. In the shadows of Spain's bloodied century, his ghost lingered not with majesty, but with mockery. Every time a child was denied bread, his name could be found between the lines of the decree. Every time a revolution was crushed, his whisper returned in the screams, not because he was strong, but because he made weakness contagious. What then is a legacy? Is it what the people remember? What the people are forced to forget? Ferdinand's was neither a triumph nor a tragedy. It was a warning. And like all warnings ignored, it did not indeed simply change names. The crown endured, the thrones remained, but the soul of Spain, scarred and cynical, would never forget the king who reigned like a shadow with a scepter made of shame. There are secrets that kill, others that shame. But the rarest breed of secret does both, not in an instant, but slowly, silently, until the man who carries it becomes a ghost in his own crown. Ferdinand VII was called many things: king, tyrant, traitor, restorer. But behind the doors of his palaces, behind the iron grip of his decrees, lay a truth so pitiful that no historian dared speak it plainly. He could not perform the simplest duty expected of a king. He could not consummate a marriage. He could not produce an heir. He could not, for years, even fulfill the image of a man, for wives, for chances. And each night ended the same, with silence, with sobbing, with priests summoned not to bless a union, but to curse a curse. Doctors were called, not to heal, but to explain away what could not be shown. Potions were brewed, relics prayed over, saints were begged to restore what manhood had forgotten. Still nothing, the court whispered. The nobles laughed behind fans, in wine goblets. Foreign ambassadors sent mocking reports to their kings, noting that Spain had a ruler in title, but not in body, and yet he refused to surrender. Instead of accepting his weakness, he wielded it as a weapon. If he could not dominate his wives, he would dominate his people. If he could not plant a seed in a womb, he would bury hope in the ground. His impotence did not humble him, it radicalized him. Every failed night became another day of paranoia, another decree of cruelty. He ruled with a hatred fueled not by power, but by shame. He did not fear assassination, he feared laughter. Then came the most grotesque irony of all. In his final marriage, through a miracle or perhaps a cruel trick of nature, an heir was conceived. But it was a daughter, a girl, a soft, unthreatening reminder that even his last victory came twisted. He had fathered not a king, but a future dispute. The wars over her right to rule would tear Spain again into fire and blood, the Carlist Wars. All born not from ambition, but from one man's humiliating failure to be the king his country begged for in the end. It was not the virginity itself that haunted Spain. It was the silence around it. The laws changed. The line of succession warped. Entire factions rose and fell all to conceal the truth no one dared put into words, that Spain's fate had been bound to a man who could not face himself. So the question remains, what is more dangerous, a king with too much power, or a king with none at all, clinging to performance while drowning in private ruin? Ferdinand VII was a man trapped in his own legend, and, like all myths sustained by shame, his secret did not die with him, lived on, like a wound never allowed to close. The child he left behind did not wear a crown, she wore a target. Isabella II, born from the only union Ferdinand could finally complete, was not a blessing. She was a breach. A girl on a throne built for men, in a kingdom that mistook bloodline for destiny and masculinity for legitimacy. Her mere existence ruptured centuries of patriarchal succession, and with it, Spain bled the moment Ferdinand died. The question was not grief, was war. Who would rule? A daughter, backed by her mother's regency in a nervous court, or a brother Don Carlos who claimed tradition, sword, and scripture on his side? The answer came not in words, but in gunpowder. The Carlist Wars, not one, but three, each a war of inheritance turned inquisition. Villages razed, priests executed, brothers betrayed. Spain became a crucible in which loyalty was melted down into hatred. And all of it, born not from ambition, but from a throne corrupted by secrecy, silence, and desperation. They called Don Carlos a usurper. Quoi? What, was he not simply echoing the law as it had always stood? Quoi? They called Isabella a queen. But was she not merely a child, propped up by the dying gasps of Ferdinand's guilt? The nation split itself in half over a man already dead, over a girl not yet grown. And as the wars dragged on, so did the myth of Ferdinand. In the north, he was remembered as a martyr of legitimacy. In Madrid, as the father of renewal. But both were lies. He was neither. He was a man whose private failures erupted into public apocalypse. And what is monarchy, if not the illusion that blood can justify rule? Ferdinand's blood had faltered. His body had failed. But instead of letting history pass him by, he rewrote. He turned his daughter's back on his brother's defiance and on 1,000 corpses buried in unnamed fields. Spain did not move forward. It spiraled. The wars did not end with victory. They ended with exhaustion. So we must ask, when a ruler dies, does his shame die with him? Or does it reincarnate repainted as ideology, wrapped in flags, and fed to children as heritage? Carlos' curse was not a policy. It was a legacy of wounded pride made manifest in bullets, okay? And its first victim was not the battlefield, it was truth. Centuries passed. The blood dried. The wars ended. The statues rose. And Ferdinand VII was sealed in marble and myth, embalmed not just in a royal tomb, but in silence. His name etched among kings, his sins hidden among whispers. For generations, no one spoke of his affliction. The royal doctors had burned the records. The midwives had died. The palace servants who had watched him limp through marble corridors, flanked by surgeons and superstition, had long turned to dust. But shame does not decompose. It waits. Then, in the archives, a letter, a note from a French surgeon, never meant to be read again, describing an intimate operation done under moonlight and morphine. Then, in the royal diaries, inconsistencies, references. 2 failed nights, 2 crying behind doors, 2 bloodied cloth hidden in chimneys. Then, in the relics of exile, portraits of a queen who seemed too afraid to breathe near her husband. And finally, among the private records of European courts, the cruel nickname, El Impotent de Madrid. The secret was not just physical, it was existential. Ferdinand's humiliation had been the Spanish crown's best guarded horror. But, like all rot, it eventually leaked. Its inability to perform as a man had forced a monarchy to lie as a nation. Treaties were signed to hide it. Wars were fought to compensate for it. A kingdom changed its laws to deny it. But a body remembers, and so do bones. Historians now piece together what courtiers once bled to erase, that the most powerful man in Spain had a wound no sword could fix. And here is the great irony. A monarch obsessed with appearing strong, whose every policy was an overcompensation for what he lacked, whose cruelty masked impotence, whose wrath camouflaged weakness. He ruled through terror, not because he had too much power, but because he feared having none. His reforms weren't to modernize Spain, they were to reassert himself as something more than a man who could not father a son, could not satisfy a wife, could not even ride a horse without pain. So, what was Ferdinand, in the end? A tyrant, a victim of his own biology, or the architect of a lie so vast it reshaped a nation's soul? Perhaps this is the true tragedy, that Spain didn't just bury a king, it buried a wound. Wound it still limps from. They gave him a funeral of state, trumpets, robes, incense so thick it drowned the stench of everything he had done. Priests called him a defender of the faith. Nobles called him the savior of Spain. They crowned his coffin with laurels, lowered his body into the crypt, as if they were burying glory itself. But there are no roses in his legacy, only thorns, because after all the terror, all the decrees, all the betrayals and purges, the future Ferdinand tried to build unraveled faster than he did. His daughter, Isabella, born after desperate medical intervention and years of political scheming, ascended, but her rule plunged Spain into civil war. His so-called Carlos legacy tore the country in two, brother against brother, monarchist against monarchist. The very child he had manipulated the throne to produce became a symbol of instability, not salvation. Spain did not rise with his death. It fractured, and behind it all, the humiliation never faded. Whispers returned to court. Foreign dignitaries mocked Spain's former king behind velvet curtains, even as portraits of Ferdinand still hung on palace walls. Servants called him the Hollow King, not because he had died, but because there had never been much within him to begin with. A monarch terrified of his own body, a husband feared by his own wife, a father desperate enough to gamble with bloodlines. His body may have rotted, but the echo of his secret endured. In ballads, in court documents, in the awkward silences of royal histories, this was his final legacy. Not heroism, not law, not unity, but shame. Shame wrapped in gold. Failure crowned with thorns. A reign so brittle, even death could not preserve its illusion. He tried to rule like an emperor, but history remembers him as a shadow one whose silence screamed louder than any edict. So let us ask one last question. Can a man who spent his life denying his own truth ever leave behind anything real? Oh, was Ferdinand VII not just Spain's most broken king, but its most dangerous illusion? This is not just a story about royalty. This is a warning about lies that become policy, about pain that becomes law, and about the terrible cost of building nations on the backs of secrets no one is willing to name.